A generation before Charles Darwin, the French scientist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was working on his own theory of evolution. Think of it as evolution version 1.0. Lamarck had some interesting things to say. He also had his share of non-scientific religious beliefs. As we have seen in this series, this is common in evolutionary thought, no less so with Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. One of his claims was an epistemological one. He claimed that in order to gain knowledge, in order for science to even work, we need to restrict ourselves strictly 100% to natural causes. Let me read to you from Lamarck. The only knowledge that is possible for us to acquire is and always will be from a study of natural laws. Now that's a significant philosophical claim, and Lamarck did nothing to defend or justify it. He simply made the claim. But what's important for us here is that it continued. This claim, this tradition continued in evolutionary thought to the point where it's really just taken for granted. And it's an important influence on evolutionary thought. I'm going to read you some examples from later evolutionists so you get a flavor for this and can hear it in their own words. We looked at Baden-Powell earlier. Now, in the years that Darwin was working on his theory, Powell made this statement, this epistemological claim, very firmly. Let me read to you from Powell. And these quotes are redacted for readability, but I'm preserving the original language here. So Powell writes, "No scientist can bring himself to believe in the existence of any real hiatus in the continuity of physical laws." So this was a principle for Powell. He claimed this was a principle, the principle of continuity of physical laws. There can be no hiatus, no gaps. All there is physical laws to the natural world. To deny this principle in any instance would be to endanger all science. So there's the epistemological claim. Science isn't going to work without sticking strictly to natural laws, natural causes. Now, where does this lead Powell? He concludes, one thing is perfectly clear. The introduction of new species was a regular phenomenon. It was not one preceding or transcending the order of nature. So there you go, the origin of species. All the species we see, he has no idea how they evolved, how they arose, but they must have arisen by natural law. So this is where this will go with evolutionary thought. You make this epistemological claim that in order for science to work, in order to gain knowledge, we have to restrict ourselves 100% to natural causes. And then you have this conclusion, the species must have arisen by natural causes. J.D. Hooker was a botanist and friend and confidant of Darwin, and in a letter to a friend, he made this sort of epistemological claim about knowledge and natural causes. Hooker wrote, "It is not that evolutionary theories are the truest, but because they do give you room to reason and reflect at present and hopes for the future. Whereas the old stick-in-the-mud doctrines are all used up. They are so many stops to further inquiry." So there you go. For our own knowledge, for the sake of science, science requires natural causes. Continuing, "If they are admitted as truths, why there is an end to the whole matter, and it is no use hoping ever to get any rational explanation of origin or dispersion of species, so I hate them." J.D. Hooker. Charles Darwin also made this epistemological claim. He did it in such a way as to define the boundaries of science. Now, this is called the demarcation problem in philosophy. Philosophers have worked on this for centuries. How do you define what is science and what is not science? Well, Darwin apparently had a proposal here in his book, Origin of Species. Let me read to you from Darwin. "On the ordinary view of the independent creation of each being, we can only say that so it is, that it has pleased the Creator to construct all the animals and plants in each great class on a uniform plan. But this is not a scientific explanation." So Darwin is demarcating non-science from science. It needs to be an appeal to natural causes and only natural causes. Okay, so you can see this claim that science must be restricted to natural causes in the early evolutionary thinkers of the 19th century. This claim is sometimes referred to as the intellectual necessity of evolution, or naturalism, because science, in order to succeed, must be restricted to these natural causes. It's an intellectual necessity. Remember, we looked at the God of the gaps argument earlier in this series. That also called for a restriction of science to natural causes, but it was for the purpose of protecting our faith. You need to not use miracles to explain a gap in your knowledge, because science will eventually explain that, and then you'll have to walk it back. That'll harm your faith. In this case, it's a similar argument, but it's to protect science. Science requires strictly naturalistic explanations, the intellectual necessity argument. Now, after Darwin, this intellectual necessity tradition persisted and became quite common in the literature. There's too many examples to quote here. I'll read to you a few examples from recent evolutionists or contemporary evolutionists from the last few decades. Paul Moody, in his textbook, writes, "Creationism is really not an explanation at all. It amounts to saying things are this way because they are this way. Furthermore, it removes the subject from scientific inquiry. One can do no more than speculate as to why the Creator chose to follow one pattern in creating diverse animals rather than to use differing patterns." Leading evolutionist Niles Eldredge wrote, "But the Creator obviously could have fashioned each species in any way imaginable. There's no basis for us to make predictions about what we should find when we study animals and plants if we accept the basic creationist position. Can't do science." Tim Barrow wrote, "Creationism has no explanatory powers, no application for future investigation, no way to advance knowledge, no way to lead to new discoveries. As far as science is concerned, creationism is a sterile concept." Again, you must have natural causes for science to succeed. Joel Craycraft, "Creationism is an anti-scientific worldview. It rejects the fundamental precept of science that phenomena in the natural world should be interpreted through naturalistic explanations." It's got to be naturalistic explanations in order for it to be science. The demarcation problem. Evolutionists have solved it. And one more from Bruce Alberts. "In evolution, as in all areas of science, our knowledge is incomplete. But the entire success of the scientific enterprise has depended on an insistence that these gaps be filled by natural explanations, logically derived from confirmable evidence." Bruce Alberts. So you get an idea of the intellectual necessity argument and tradition in the literature and its prevalence. One obvious problem right off the bat is that it simply is not true. There are many areas of science, many activities that we would consider to be science that are not restricted to natural explanations, to natural causes. Think of anthropology or forensics. SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, is in fact exactly the opposite. You have astronomers looking into the heavens, looking for radio signals that are not natural, that do not have natural causes. SETI is exactly the opposite. It is looking for signals that are not, causes that are not natural. It gets even worse when we look at evolution, because evolutionary theory itself is an ad hoc theory. You've heard of natural selection, gradualism, common descent. These are all fundamental tenets of evolutionary theory. This is how evolution works. It works according to these things, except when it doesn't. All of them are forfeitable. Evolution works according to natural selection, except when it doesn't. Evolution is gradual, except when it isn't. Evolution works according to common descent, the common descent pattern, except when it doesn't. All of these things can and have been forfeited over and over again. Evolution is an ad hoc theory itself. But let's set that criticism aside for a moment, because there's another, I think, more important problem, more important criticism of this intellectual necessity argument, this intellectual necessity tradition. And that is that the intellectual necessity tradition makes the scientific evidence irrelevant. Evolution is the right answer. It has to be the right answer regardless of what the evidence says. The evidence doesn't matter. Well, that isn't very scientific. But furthermore, what does it say about the claim that evolution is a scientific fact? That is, after all, the claim, the universal consensus claim in the literature that evolution is a scientific fact, no question about it, beyond all reasonable doubt. But what does that mean if science has been so defined? If evolution is by definition the only right answer, the only acceptable answer, well, of course it's a scientific fact. You defined it that way. Religion drives science, and it matters.